Today I'm going to review Visconti's Opera-Elements with the air yellow finish, and this is the later generation with the 23 karat palladium Dream Touch nib, as opposed to the earlier 14 karat gold nib that Stephen Brown reviewed in his review several years ago. So the pen has the brown and white striations, and the metal finishings are a gold color. The shape of the barrel and the cap is an interesting rounded square or squared circle, where the sides here are flat, but these corners are round. Here's the cap. The material is actually somewhat translucent. You can see the metal inside. The bridge clip here is kind of interesting. It's also golden colored, but with a white filled in lacquer of Visconti. It gives it a very nice look. It's spring loaded, so you can kind of lift it and it'll spring back into action. I found it to work pretty well in my pants. A few other people have complained about this clip, but I really don't find any problems with it. The finial is a nice gold Visconti. Now, to open this pen, you just turn it 90 degrees. Move it. So the nib is pretty big. I don't know what size it is, but let's have a closer look. It's a single color golden nib. This one's a medium. Again, it's the 23 karat palladium nib. And the feed is not just a generic feed, it's actually got the Visconti V on it. Now, one thing I like to complain about is this section. It's a metal, golden plated probably section. And it tends to pick up scratches. You can see all these little scratches, and fingerprints. It feels nice. The pen itself is very balanced in my hand whenever I'm writing. But that golden section, and also this end bit here, tends to really pick up micro scratches. So let's remove the barrel. Just a few turns and the barrel comes off. And it's a cartridge converter. Visconti has a very nice cartridge converter. There's this custom with the V at the end. Pretty easy to take apart. Nice and fluid, the movement. And it's screwed in, which I definitely appreciate. Sometimes the converters tend to slide out of the pen, and this one just screw right in. What I have found, though, is in the past, my pen leaked through this area, so just putting a little bit of silicone grease here would prevent that from happening. Otherwise, this is a very nice pen. The nib is also a joy to write with, but we'll explore that in the writing section. Now on to a writing sample. First, I need to ink the pen. I decided to go with an ink that looks very similar to this brown color. Diamine makes a nice shading brown amber called Autumn Oak, and I loaded it into this traveling inkwell. We're going to use that for the filling. So in order to use this inkwell, you remove the top, of course, with the inkwell upright. You don't want the ink to flow out. Then remove the top cap. And inside, you'll find an absorbent pad. We're going to use that to clean off the nib after we filled it. So let's move the cap off to the side. Now to fill the pen, you just remove the cap. You remove the barrel. And then, importantly, you push in the piston. This is important because we don't want to pressurize the inkwell when we fill it up. that could result in leakage. So take the ink pot here, stick the pen in until it's nice and snug. So you can see the nib through the window there. And now invert it. Now all we want to do is suck the ink into the converter. You have to shake it a little bit. It looks like there's a little bit of an air bubble in there. Push it back out. And now suck it back in. Now I have a full fill. Invert. Remove the pen. Now the section is still clean because it was outside of the ink reservoir. And just simply clean off the nib. Put the barrel back on. Now we're ready for the writing sample. For the writing sample, I decided to go with 4 different kinds of paper. This is cheap HP copy paper. Tends to be more textured than the other papers. If you look really closely, you can see this texturing. It's very grainy and tends to be very absorbent, so it's not good for things like dip, nib, calligraphy, or if you have a gusher of a pen, you might want to avoid this sort of paper. So, let's do a writing sample. So this is the visconti-opera-elements. Medium. And this is Dream Touch. Not sure I would consider this flexible or semi-flex or anything. It's actually kind of stiff for a palladium nib. And you can see that if you press a little bit. Sure, you'll get some slight flexibility and variation, but it's not very significant. I wouldn't consider it anywhere near a Falcon nib or an Ahab even. But it's a pretty comfortable writer. Definitely puts down the ink. So let's write something. Now you'll notice we have decent ink flow. It's pretty wet. I'm not going to rub my finger over it or anything, considering how much ink it lays down. But that's really nice with this ink. This is the Diamine Autumn Oak. It tends to really shade well, so you can see the dark red to the orange. Gives it a nice look. So let's see what happens if we speed up the writing a bit. See if the nib and feed will keep up with it. So I wrote that pretty quickly, and it did keep up. There were no skips. Let's see how it does in terms of wetness. Yeah, it's pretty wet. Definitely put the ink down. That's something that I really appreciate in a pen. Visconti tends to do that. They tend to optimize their pens for wetness. It gives it a nice feel, a nice dark feel. If you're writing with black, for example, there's really no shading. Even if you have a grayish ink, it'll come out as nice and black. And I really like that. It's also really good for shading inks, like this, where you can see Look really close. In the B, get the nice dark red, lighter orange, and the L. So it's a consistent writer, it's a wet writer, and I definitely appreciate that. Let's see how the paper held up. So not bad. If I were to use this for an assignment, or if I were to take a test with this pen, I don't think I would feel uncomfortable writing on both sides. You can see it, but it's really unnoticeable. Here we have the flexibility test, and it's a little darker, but it didn't soak through the paper. So even on this paper, it shaded pretty well. We'll move on to something that tends to shade a lot better, and that's Tomoe River paper. This is the cream color version. Now we expect this paper to really pull out the shading, and with this wet nib, we'll see that. So. Again, a joy to write with. Tons and tons of ink. And the shading is pretty impressive. I would argue on the same scale with Apache Sunset. Gives it a nice depth. Again, dark where the ink pools, and then a lighter up here at the top of the loops. So let's do a little bit of a patch here, see what happens. Very wet. On to another paper. This is another specialty paper that comes from Japan. It comes in these airmail booklets, and I believe this is onion skin paper, or paper that is very similar to onion skin. It's actually thinner than Tomoe River paper. It's more of a tracing paper, so you could put this over something and trace it. But what's unique about it is that it is not very absorbent. So, I apologize for the handwriting. Not really doing any sort of calligraphy competition here. Now, this is not particularly nice looking paper because it doesn't have a constant density. It's sort of flaky, but you can see how the ink puddled at the top gives it a nice shading quality, and it dried really quickly. That's kind of surprising. Here, although there's a lot of show through, it did not soak through the paper. To do a comparison with our Tomoe River paper, show through is not as significant, and also no soak through. Although this is a sort of paper where you could just dump the ink on the paper, and in fact I'll do that just to show you what I mean. I would not recommend doing this ever, but for science, put a puddle there and see what happens. Okay. It looks like blood. And we'll get back to that. The other paper that I wanted to review was my go-to class notes paper, and that is red and black. So this is made, I believe, in the UK. You can buy it on Amazon for $2 or $3 a notebook, which is reasonable. I've used this already, so I'm jumping to a page I haven't used yet. And it's nice lined paper. It's very nice and white, and it tends to work well with fountain pens. Absorbent, so you don't have to worry about blotter paper or waiting until your writing dries to flip to the next page without fear of smudging. but also relatively cheap. So, writes well. Fairly wet. In fact, very wet indeed. And virtually no show through. So this is really why I use this as my paper of choice. And I recommend this to everybody who uses fountain pens. Even for a broad fountain pen, this will do all right. It's not as ink resistant as Tomoe River, but it's good enough for everything up to a medium or broad nib. Stub, you might see a little bit of ink on the other side of the paper. So, back to our little experiment. Here we are with our little lead pool. I'll use my ink cloth here to pull what's left off the top. And I mean, it deformed the paper. That's something you really can't avoid, but it did not soak through the other side. And that's why this Tomoe River is really considered a premium paper for fountain pen users. So, back to the pen. Very comfortable, balanced pen, made by Visconti. It's a cartridge converter filler, which is unlike the company. Most of their pens are use vacuum filling or pistons, but this is a nice pen, and it's a nice converter. I mean, it's not one of the cheapo Chinese ones that you have to worry about breaking all the time. It holds a decent amount of ink. I think it's maybe somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4 of a milliliter of ink. So that'll keep you over for maybe a week or two of a decent amount of writing. The nib is nice. It's not flexible at all, but it's pretty smooth. You can hear a little bit of scratching, and that's largely due to the fact that it's a stiff nib, but it does glide across the paper without any problems. The pen looks really nice. I like the brown and white candy cane look, and the nib is absolutely gorgeous. I like the nice design on the nib instead of just a plain flat nib like you might see in a Lamy. And the capping mechanism is really nice, just the quarter turn. It's faster. It's spring loaded, so pretty quick, pretty reliable seal. You don't have to worry about this thing coming off in your pants pocket. That's something that I complain about with the Safari here. It's not unusual for the pen to pop off and kind of float around my pocket, filling it with ink. Even the Lamy 2000 is kind of a similar issue. It will, under enough pressure, say you're running or something, pop off. And at that point, slides down your pants pocket, and then ink just starts gushing out the top. So screw-type capping mechanisms like this Faber-Castell Emotion are nice, because this one grips pretty well. There's a little bit of a rubber here that keeps it together nicely. So this works well, but I would say this is the most reliable. I mean, there's really no way of this cap coming off unless you, again, push it in and turn it. So I do believe this pen is discontinued, or if it isn't, it's difficult to find. I would recommend it to anybody. There's some people that try to avoid cartridge converters, but this is actually a pretty nice one, and with cartridges, it's easier to clean it out. I mean, I would feel comfortable even using maybe Bay State Blue in this pen, because I can completely take it apart. I can unscrew the converter and wash it out, bleach it out as necessary. It's harder to do that with a piston filler. I mean, somehow you need to get in here and wash the inside, and that's a non-trivial exercise. So, this is my short review of the Visconti Opera-Elements.